DOJ Chief Guevarra. Sufficient evidence found against Philhealth's Execs and Boards.
Do you think you have an airtight case against the Philhealth officials?
Well, for those na na-identify na namin, I think we have sufficient evidence para consider ito ng Ombudsman for the possible finding of probable cause.
Videos with current events.
Has granted with special powers.
Videos with interesting stories.
Sikorsky S-70
Videos with thrilling facts.
coronavirus.
And entertaining videos. This is MIL Teacher Sir Arjay, where you can get your daily dose of reliable information.
Unahin po muna natin si Secretary Maynard. Sir, thank you very much for joining us. This is your one of the rare public appearances that you've had so far to discuss your report on Task Force Philhealth. The floor is yours, Secretary Guevarra.
Tanghali, Sec Harry. From a general perspective, we find that persons who are supposed to set the policies and operational guidelines for the management of the Philippine Health Insurance Corporation, namely the Board of Directors and the Executive Committee, have not shown the due diligence required of them in the discharge of their duties, particularly in the disbursement of the National Health Insurance Fund. Their lack of diligence in due care has been highlighted in, among others, the following. Letter A, their approval and implementation of the Interim Reimbursement Mechanism, or IRM, without sufficient standards. Letter B, their approval of Philhealth's Information and Communications Technology, or ICT, budget upon a mere representation by the SVP in charge that the whole management information system of Philhealth would collapse unless said budget was approved. And letter C, their adoption of corporate policies and practices that fail to check, investigate, prosecute, and penalize the wrongdoing of Philhealth personnel, as well as healthcare institutions and professionals. On the IRM, the Executive Committee showed lack of due care, if not outright negligence, in approving and implementing the IRM as manifested by the following. Letter A, IRM fund releases were rushed even when the circular implementing the scheme was not yet effective. On 31 March 2020, the Executive Committee presented for the Board's approval the allocation of 27 billion pesos as IRM funds for the COVID-19 pandemic and asked the Board to ratify IRM releases already made, despite the fact that the circular had not yet been deposited with the Office of the National Administrative Register, or ONAR, as required by law. The Board approved both requests. Letter B, the IRM was implemented without sufficient standards and guidelines, making fund releases susceptible to abuse. In converting the IRM into a special privilege, the circular removed the need for prior Board approval for IRM fund releases whenever a fortuitous event occurs, and for the issuance of new guidelines for its implementation. It likewise removed a number of requirements previously imposed upon HCIs, such as the survey and post-survey requirements, and centralized the evaluation of IRM fund beneficiaries at the Office of the PCEO. Letter C, IRM fund releases were made despite the absence of mechanisms to monitor fund utilization and liquidation, and without taxes due thereon being withheld. On the ICT procurement, members of the Executive Committee led by President and Chief Executive Officer Ricardo Morales and SVP Jovita Aragona, Chief Information Officer and Head of the Information Management Sector, submitted to the Board a request for budget allocation for the procurement of ICT resource items for fiscal year 2020 worth 734 million pesos, more or less. The ICT items were neither included in Philhealth's Information System Strategic Plan, or ISSP, nor approved by the Department of Information and Communications Technology as required by law. Letter B, an internal audit report that detailed major discrepancies or inconsistencies in the inventory of PhilHealth's hardware and software was not presented to the board upon the instance of PCEO Morales. Letter C, a proposal to procure network switches for the PhilHealth Regional Office at the National Capital Region was recommended to and approved by the board, notwithstanding a Commission on Audit query memorandum on the non-utilization of 24 similar switches. Next, the PhilHealth management adopted questionable policies and weak enforcement practices that failed to check, investigate, prosecute, and penalize wrongdoing. The PhilHealth management has adopted a policy towards airtight settlement of claims without accountability, and even the grant of wholesale amnesty in favor of HCIs with claims that appear to be no longer enforceable against a corporation. Based on the investigation of the Senate, less than 2/3 of the 7,452 pending cases against HCIs, these are the hospitals and professionals, from 2010 to 2019 had been acted upon by the corporation, less than 2/3. Meanwhile, only a little over 1/3 of the 1,968 cases of fraudulent claims from the year 2000 to 2019 had been decided. Finally, in his testimony before the task force, SVP Rodolfo Del Rosario of the legal sector admitted that thousands of cases involving HCIs and PhilHealth employees have remained unfiled. So, in our conclusion, we said the following. The negligence exhibited by certain officers of the Philhealth Executive Committee gives rise to both administrative and criminal liability under the following laws. RA number 1319, or the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act, the Revised Penal Code for malversation of public funds or property, and illegal use of public funds or property, and administratively, gross misconduct and gross neglect of duty under civil service laws. In addition, the same corporate officers may be held liable for violation of the National Internal Revenue Code in connection with their failure to withhold taxes on IRM releases. Next, the board chairman and members exceed negligence in services to wit, their careless approval of ICT procurement, the ratification of IRM fund releases in March 2020, and consent to modification of judgments in court-adjudicated cases. Such negligence is somehow mitigated by the active concealment of vital documents and information and the apparent misrepresentation by those who had sought the board's approval. The foregoing notwithstanding, the task force recommends that the President strongly admonish and remind the chairman and members of the board of the grave consequences of their action or inaction. After that, we went to the specific recommendations for the President's consideration, specific charges against particular persons. And I guess by now, alam na ng media what these charges are and who the respondents would be when complaints are filed with the Office of the Ombudsman. But let me just emphasize that further investigation on possible complaints against other officials and employees of PhilHealth, and this is contained in Part 6 of our 177-page report, is also recommended. So marami pa kaming other areas na titingnan. No? Yung legal sector that is ripe for many possible legal actions, but we have not included that in the report as yet dahil we need further supporting evidence to back up the charges that we intend to file. Kaya hindi sila nasama dito sa report na ito. But this report, we submitted only because we were required by the President to submit it within 30 days. And we submitted it within the period given to us. But it doesn't mean that yung mga investigations that we have already commenced and those that are already pending will not be continued. So we are assuring the people that investigations on other anomalies or irregularities are being conducted and will continue until we have brought to justice people who are responsible for these anomalies. Thank you, Sec. Hari, thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Secretary Guevarra. I'm sure the media will have many, many questions for you.
Can Secretary Duque as well as PhilHealth President Morales be held liable under the doctrine of willful blindness used by DOJ prosecutors in filing anti-money laundering charges against the executives of RCBC in connection with the $81 million cyber heist at the Bank of Bangladesh?
Alam mo, Evelyn, it may be too early to answer that question kasi sabi ko nga sa iyo, kinukompleto pa ang ebidensya na maaring ihain sa Office of the Ombudsman, although we have an idea already what it is. But there is a possibility. But right now, ang hawak namin, ang nakikita namin ay hindi pa talaga sufficient para masabi natin na may gross, inexcusable negligence on the part of Secretary Duque and members of the board.
Sa tingin nyo, kailangan po ba talaga na isailalim sa hospital arrest si Morales? Ano ba dapat ang maging panuntunan bago payagan na ang isang nasangkot sa kontrobersya na may sakit ay isailalim sa hospital arrest o kaya naman ay sa house arrest?
Secretary Guevarra.
Ko ba sasagot?
Yes, Sec. If you care to answer.
If you may. Itong hospital arrest kasi pinag-uusapan ito pag yung kaso ay nasa husgado na. In the case of violators ng Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Law, pagka nasa Sandigan Bayan na. Isa ngayon ay yung complaint ay ipa-file pa lang. At pag-file niyan sa ombudsman, yan ay ang ombudsman ay magko-conduct ng sarili niyang fact-finding and preliminary investigation. At kung merong finding sila ng probable cause, at saka pa lang yan aakyat sa korte, sa Sandigan Bayan. Kaya yung matter of arrest, ay lumilitaw yun, nalalabas na lang yun pagka yung kaso ay nakarating na sa husgado. Kaya sa ngayon ay hindi pa natin pinag-uusapan yung tungkol sa arrest. Kasi yun nga, complaint pa lang, di pa nga napapile, ipa-file pa lang Kaya too early para pag-usapan yan. And besides, merong discretion to or authority to decide on that will be the court itself. Depende sa actual circumstances.
Can you quantify the amount that is either lost from the government or went into the pockets of some corrupt officials sa PhilHealth based on your investigation? Or if you don't have the figures, how would you describe, sir, the corruption in PhilHealth from what you have discovered in your investigation?
Joseph, it's rather difficult to make an estimate kasi on the part of the task force ay hindi naman lahat ng areas na tingin namin ay may possible irregularity ay natingnan namin. We have only explored certain areas like ITM, the IRM, ICT, procurement, and so forth and so on. But based on what we have seen, and this has been going on for many years, like yung mga nagpa-file ng fraudulent claims, padding, and so forth and so on, we believe that we are talking about hundreds of billions of pesos here over the years. So definitely I cannot give you any parang reasonable figure to go by, but we're talking about the magnitude of hundreds of billions over the years.
How do you describe, sir, the corruption in PhilHealth?
Yung corruption in PhilHealth, ang tingin ko dyan ay na-engender because of a culture of tolerance. Yung parang hindi sila naghihigpit among themselves for some reason or another. Kaya over the years parang na-tolerate yung ganyan mga practices, the various complaints, legal actions that should be taken against wrongdoers have not been filed, have not been acted upon really actively. Kaya parang nagkakaroon ng ng parang culture na well, I wouldn't say impunity, but something like a culture of tolerance na hayaan mo na lang, yung tipong ganun, and so parang I hope I'm not doing an unfair statement because I know na marami rin namang mga taong matitino at gumagawa ng kanilang trabaho ng mahusay sa PhilHealth. Pero we have seen it already, no? The Congress, the task force, the many cases already filed before the Ombudsman, before the Civil Service Commission. Nakikita na natin kung gaano kalawak at kung gaano nakatagal ito. So, bakit nangyari ito na for so many years ay walang pagbabago sa PhilHealth? So, yun nga parang naging culture na parang nagbibigayan na rin, papasensyahan na, they tolerate each other. Kaya kailangan nga na some very definitive action will have to be taken, no? Some drastic action para mawala yung ganyang culture na parang nakakalusot yung mga ganyang irregularity or time to stop.
Time to stop, sir. Yes. Sir, since you mentioned the very definitive action, given what you have discovered, do you think that PhilHealth, as of today, or as of based on your investigation, it is beyond salvation such that it's better to abolish it? And the related question is, when are you going to file the complaint, sir?
Well, yung filing of the complaints, we hope to be able to do so within the next 30 days. No? Kasi we have to gather the necessary supporting documentary evidence. As I was mentioning earlier, we know where they are, but physically, we have to obtain them para ma-attach sa complaint. So that takes some time also. No? Now, as to the matter of what to do sa PhilHealth, well, of course, there are proposals na i-abolish na lang yan or palitan na lang yan ng some new institution or what. No? Pero ako, ang tingin ko, baka naman meron pang po pwedeng gawin. That's why we recommended to the President to direct the GCG, the Governance Commission for Government-Owned and Controlled Corporations, para gumawa ng sarili nilang evaluation for a possible reorganization of PhilHealth. And maybe in the interim, the creation of an interim management committee. Kasi when we go to Congress can very easily do that. But it will take some time also because of the congressional legislative process. Yes. So in the meantime, within the executive department, that is what I can see. Nandiyan yung GCG, meron siyang power to introduce or to recommend reorganization, partial or total reorganization without really abolishing the entity. No? So I guess we could explore that option muna kasi that is less drastic than abolishing or privatizing the corporation.
Secretary Guevarra, did the President's statements before you finished your probe on PhilHealth, when he was saying that he fully trusts Secretary Duque, did that affect in any way the conclusions that the task force made on who to file charges against?
Not at all, Pia. Walang epekto yon as far as the task force is concerned, more particularly the DOJ. As I repeatedly have said before, we will only go by the evidence presented before us. So kung meron kaming makita, so be it. Kung wala naman, wala. Pero kung meron, meron. Meron kaming nakitang petition against him, we'll include him and probably the rest of the board if need be.
Mm-hmm. Sir, you mentioned in your report that the fact that the people who asked for approval of the board hid certain documents is a mitigating factor in your decision to just give an admonishment to the board. So, sir, isn't it though part of due diligence for the board to check if there was duplicity, to maybe catch any hiding or any parang efforts to hide certain documents? I mean, wouldn't they have caught that if they did their due diligence?
Actually, kung talagang you will exert due diligence, no, you might have probably discovered that. But considering that, the board is generally a policy-making body, and really the operational side is being done by the executive committee, chances are pagdating sa board mismo, no, which basically makes decisions on policy directions, no, ay talagang siguro baka in practice baka kulang na rin sila ng time and effort para kumbaga parang repasuhin, no, na sila mismo ang mismong magbubusisi niyan, so to speak, no. Kaya it's really quite of necessity na parang you will have to rely on the inputs being submitted to you by the executive committee, which is really the operational side of the whole thing, because this is composed of the senior vice presidents and the president of the company itself. the corporation itself.
Okay.
The investigation on Philhealth has just begun. When will the agencies complete their investigation? What other aspects are being looked into?
Right now, we're focusing on another sector na hindi nakasama doon sa report na sinabit namin to the President. We're looking at the legal sector. So for those that we have already identified, yung sa IRM at saka yung sa ICT or procurement, so possibly within the month ay mapafile na in 30 days yung complaints pertaining to this. Yung sa legal sector, maybe in another 2 months.
Last question po from Evelyn Quiroz ng Filipino Mirror for Secretary Guevarra. Do you think you have an airtight case against the Philhealth officials?
Well, for those na na-identify na namin, I think we have sufficient evidence para consider ito ng ombudsman for the possible finding of probable cause. But we will not preempt the ombudsman. From our point of view, I am saying that we have sufficient evidence.
I'd like to exercise the prerogative of the moderator, in the open forum. Secretary Guevarra, Attorney Jojo Del Rosario, head of legal of Philhealth, posted in his Facebook that he's already celebrating that he was not amongst those charged by Task Force Philhealth. Should he really be celebrating already? Attorney Jojo Del Rosario, former head of legal of Philhealth.
Sec Harry, kasasabi ko lang na ang susunod namin tatargetin ay ang legal sector. Inuna lang namin talaga yung dalawa, yung ICT procurement sa IRM kasi yun lang ang natapos namin within the 30 days. Pero actually nasimulan namin yung legal sector din. Hindi lang na-complete. Kaya yan ang target namin for the next maybe 1 or 2 months, the legal sector. So, wag muna siyang pakasiguro.
Ay, maraming salamat po.